There's a story that few know outside of Jamaica, but one that shook the very foundations of an entire country. A story about absolute power, limitless violence, and a confrontation that seemed straight out of a war movie. But this isn't fiction. This is the brutal reality of Christopher Michael Coke, known as Dudus, the man who transformed a Kingston neighborhood into his personal kingdom and challenged entire armed forces to maintain his criminal empire. Before we continue, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. And if you're enjoying this content, don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps get this incredible story out to more people. Born on March 13, 1969 in Kingston, Jamaica, Dudus wasn't an ordinary person. He inherited more than just his father's last name from Lester Lloyd Coke, known as Jim Brown. He inherited a criminal empire. And we're not talking about petty crimes. We're talking about the Shower Posse, one of the most violent criminal organizations in the Caribbean, responsible for over 1,000 murders between the late 80s and early 90s. But here's the most disturbing part of this story. Dudus wasn't just a common criminal. He presented himself as a savior, as a benefactor, as a modern-day Robin Hood who distributed food, paid for children's education, and built medical clinics in Tivoli Gardens, the housing complex he controlled like a feudal lord of modern times. And you know what's scarier? People believed it. People defended him. People were willing to die for him. Let's make one thing crystal clear right now. There's no glamour in crime. There's no heroism in drug dealers. Dudus Coke built his empire on corpses, on families destroyed by cocaine, on young people who never had the chance to choose a different path because they were born in territories controlled by gangs. He wasn't a benefactor. He was a manipulator. Every school he funded, every meal he distributed, was an invisible chain binding that community to his control. Dudus's story begins long before he took power. His father, Lester Coke, founded the Shower Posse in the 70s with indirect support from international forces during the Cold War. Yes, you heard that right. While the world experienced tensions between capitalism and socialism, Jamaica was a proxy battlefield where gangs were financed and armed to combat adverse political influences. Lester Coke became one of the largest marijuana and cocaine traffickers to the United States, a valuable political ally in times of violent partisan conflicts. Dudus grew up in that world, a world where guns were more common than books, where violence was currency, and where the only respected law was the law of the strongest. But here's the contradiction. Despite growing up amid absolute chaos, Dudus attended elite schools in Kingston. While his father coordinated brutal executions and sent tons of drugs to American territory, his son received privileged education. This duality was always present in Christopher Coke's life. Family tragedy was constant. His sister was murdered in 1987, his brother in 2004, both killed in contexts of drug-related violence. And in 1992, when Dudus was only 23 years old, his father died in a suspicious fire inside a prison cell while awaiting extradition to the United States. Officially, it was an accident. But in Jamaica, nobody believed that. Lester Coke knew too much, had too many connections, and died before he could talk. It was at that moment that Christopher Dudus Coke took command of the Shower Posse, and he didn't just continue his father's legacy, he expanded it. Dudus transformed Tivoli Gardens into a state within a state. The Jamaican police only entered the neighborhood with his permission. Local disputes were resolved not by official justice, but by Dudus's personal tribunal. He distributed social benefits, mediated conflicts, provided protection, and in return demanded absolute loyalty. But behind this facade of benevolent Don operated a death machine. Dudus commanded a multi-million-dollar empire of cocaine and weapons. His operations extended to New York, where the Shower Posse controlled drug sales points and executed rivals with shocking brutality. Phone intercepts revealed over 50,000 calls since 2004, where Dudus coordinated drug shipments, money laundering, and murders planned down to the smallest details. One of the most shocking cases involved the order to dismember a rival with a power saw. It wasn't just about killing, it was about sending a message. It was pure terror. The United States Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA, described him as Jamaica's largest marijuana exporter in the 2000s. But Dudus never admitted anything. Publicly, he was just a community leader, concerned about his people. And here we arrive at the crucial point, the political connection. Tivoli Gardens wasn't just a criminal stronghold, It was a political garrison, a neighborhood controlled by the Jamaica Labour Party, the JLP. The Koch family was a historical ally of the party. In exchange for guaranteed votes in elections, politicians turned a blind eye to criminal activities. It was a dark pact that perpetuated both political power and the crime empire. In 2009, the United States indicted Dudus for conspiracy and racketeering, drug trafficking, and weapons. The evidence was overwhelming. Audio recordings, financial documents, testimonies. Washington formally requested extradition. And that's when everything started to fall apart. The Jamaican Prime Minister at the time, Bruce Golding of the JLP, was the Member of Parliament for Tivoli Gardens. He and Dudus had a relationship that many described as too close. When the extradition request arrived, Golding refused. He claimed the evidence was obtained through illegal wiretapping, violating Jamaican laws, but the truth was much dirtier. Subsequent investigations revealed that Golding, through JLP members, authorized a $400,000 contract with the American law firm Manat, Phelps and Phillips to lobby against Dudus's extradition in the United States. $400,000 spent to protect a criminal. When this came to light in March 2010, the scandal was devastating. The political opposition demanded Golding's resignation. Protests took to the streets. International pressure increased. The United States issued travel warnings for Jamaica. The country was on the verge of economic sanctions, and Golding had no way to hold the situation any longer. On May 17, 2010, in a televised address to the nation, Bruce Golding announced he would sign the extradition order for Christopher Dudus Koch. Attorney General Dorothy Lightbourne formalized the document. The noose was tightening. Dudus knew exactly what would happen if he was sent to the United States. He knew his father's fate, who died before setting foot on American soil. He knew the harshness of the American penal system. He knew the sentences that awaited criminals of his caliber, and he wasn't willing to surrender without a fight. What happened in the following days shocked not only Jamaica but the entire world. On May 23, 2010, gangsters loyal to Dudus attacked 4 police stations in Kingston. Barricades were erected in Tivoli Gardens. Over 500 armed men with AK-47 rifles, grenades, and improvised explosive devices transformed the neighborhood into a war zone. Cars were set on fire and used as blockades. Electrified barbed wire was installed on the streets. Snipers took positions on rooftops. Clandestine Molotov cocktail factories operated at full speed. Ammunition depots were discovered in residential homes. Tivoli Gardens was no longer a neighborhood. It was a fortress. The Jamaican government had no choice. On May 24, 2010, a state of emergency was declared in Kingston and the parish of St. Andrew. Over 1,000 soldiers and 300 police officers were mobilized for the operation that became known as the Tivoli incursion. The advance was slow and brutal. To travel just 200 meters inside the neighborhood, security forces took 2 hours. Intense fighting erupted at every corner. Grenades exploded. Crossfire cut through the air. The sound of helicopters and rifle fire echoed throughout Kingston. Residents who weren't involved in the confrontation were trapped in their homes, terrified, not knowing if they would survive. And then came information that the Jamaican government initially tried to deny. A P-3 Orion surveillance aircraft from the United States Air Force was providing real-time images of the operation. American aid wasn't just diplomatic or legal, it was military. And this generated even more controversy about Jamaican sovereignty and the United States' role in the conflict. By May 26th, over 500 arrests had been made, but the death toll was the most shocking. At least 73 civilians were killed during the operation. Most were young men under 30 years old. 4 police officers and soldiers also lost their lives. Dozens were injured. Bodies began to accumulate in Kingston's morgues, many in a state of decomposition due to delays in identification. 2 women were among the victims. International organizations like Amnesty International and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights called for impartial investigations. There were reports of summary executions, of abuses, of disproportionate violence. The Red Cross visited detainees, and although it found no evidence of systematic abuse, the climate of distrust was widespread. The world watched in astonishment. Flights to Kingston were cancelled. Cricket matches were postponed. Jamaica, known for its paradisiacal beaches and vibrant culture, was in international headlines as an armed conflict zone. And all of this because of one man who had so much power that an entire nation needed to mobilize its army to detain him. But where was Dudus during all this? That's the question everyone was asking. While Tivoli Gardens burned in flames and dozens died defending his territory, Christopher Dudus Coke seemed to have disappeared. Some theories suggested he had fled to rural areas, others that he was hiding in some secret stronghold within Kingston. There were even those who bet he had already left the country. The operation recovered 88 firearms, 19 grenades, 32 improvised explosive devices, and thousands of rounds of ammunition. It was a war arsenal. This wasn't street gang equipment. This was urban guerrilla armament. And all of this was in the hands of a criminal organization led by a single man. The state of emergency extended for almost a month, until June 23, 2010. During this period, Kingston lived under curfew. Security forces occupied Tivoli Gardens, searching every house, every street, every possible hiding place. But Dudus remained at large, and then, on June 22, 2010, what many no longer expected happened. Christopher Dudus Coke surrendered. But the circumstances of his capture were as controversial as everything else in his story. He was found at a police checkpoint, disguised as a woman, wearing a wig and women's clothing. He was on his way to the United States Embassy. The surrender was mediated by Reverend Al Miller, a religious leader with connections in both the criminal world and political circles. Miller was later interrogated about his involvement in the case, generating even more suspicions about who actually facilitated Dudus's capture or negotiated surrender. In his statement, "Before we dive into the conclusion of this shocking story, I want to know, are you still with me? Where are you watching from? And if you're following this incredible journey, hit that like button. It makes all the difference in spreading this content to more people who need to hear this truth." In his statement, Dudus claimed he was surrendering to end the violence that had consumed Kingston. He said he renounced fighting extradition to benefit his family and community. It was a calculated move, a final attempt to maintain the image of a selfless leader who put his people above himself. But let's be absolutely clear, this wasn't nobility. This was a cornered criminal with no way out, trying to control the narrative one last time. The surrender itself was theatrical. Disguised as a woman with a wig and dress, Dudus was attempting to slip through security checkpoints undetected. When he was stopped and identified, the game was over. The man who had ruled Tivoli Gardens with absolute authority, who commanded an army of loyal soldiers, who had politicians in his pocket, was now just another prisoner being processed by the system he had spent decades evading. Christopher Dudus Coke was immediately placed under heavy security. The Jamaican authorities weren't taking any chances. There were genuine fears that his supporters might attempt a rescue operation or launch more attacks to free him. Armed convoys transported him. Elite units guarded every movement. The country was still on edge, still recovering from the bloodshed of the previous weeks. On June 23, 2010, just one day after his capture, Dudus was extradited to the United States. The speed of the extradition was unprecedented. Normally, such processes take months, sometimes years, with appeals and legal battles. But there was nothing normal about this case. The Jamaican government wanted him out of the country as quickly as possible. Every moment he remained on Jamaican soil was a potential flashpoint for more violence. He arrived in New York under heavy escort. Federal agents surrounded him at every point. The media frenzy was intense. Here was the man who had defied an entire nation, who had caused a military operation that killed dozens, who had run a multi-million-dollar drug empire spanning continents, and now he was in American custody, facing the full weight of the United States justice system. The charges against him were extensive and damning. Conspiracy to distribute marijuana and cocaine, conspiracy to illegally traffic in firearms, racketeering conspiracy. Each charge carried severe penalties. The evidence was overwhelming. Those 50,000 intercepted phone calls, financial records showing millions of dollars in drug proceeds, witness testimonies from former associates who had turned against him, forensic evidence linking him to specific shipments and specific murders. But Dudus surprised many observers. On August 30, 2011, he pleaded guilty. He admitted to conspiracy in racketeering and assault. It wasn't a full confession to everything he was accused of, but it was enough. By pleading guilty, he avoided a lengthy trial that would have exposed even more horrific details of his criminal operations. He also secured a slightly reduced sentence through the plea agreement. Still, when sentencing day came on June 8, 2012, Judge Robert P. Patterson of the Southern District of New York showed no mercy. He sentenced Christopher "Dudus" Coke to 23 years in federal prison, the maximum sentence allowed under the plea agreement. In his remarks, Judge Patterson described Dudus's organization as an empire of terror that had caused immeasurable suffering in both Jamaica and the United States. 23 years. That's how long Dudus would spend behind bars. No more empire, no more power, no more control. Just a prison cell in the Federal Correctional Institution in Fort Dix, New Jersey, where he remains to this day under prisoner registration number 022577748. But the story doesn't end with Dudus's imprisonment. The consequences of the Tivoli incursion and the entire scandal continued to reverberate through Jamaica for years. Prime Minister Bruce Golding survived a vote of no confidence by a razor-thin margin, 30 votes to 28. But his credibility was shattered. The man who had tried to protect a drug lord who had spent $400,000 of what many suspected was public money to lobby for a criminal could never fully recover politically. The scandal accelerated political reforms in Jamaica. There were calls for term limits, for transparency in party financing, for an end to the garrison politics that had plagued the country for decades. The system that had allowed a criminal like Dudus to gain such power, that had created the conditions where politicians needed gang leaders to deliver votes, was finally being questioned openly. In 2014, a commission of inquiry was established under Sir David Simmons to investigate the Tivoli incursion. The inquiry, known as the Tivoli Inquiry, heard testimonies from survivors, from security forces, from politicians, from human rights observers. The accounts were harrowing. Stories of young men shot in cold blood, of homes invaded without warrants, of excessive force used against civilians who posed no threat. The Commission made several recommendations: compensation for victims and their families, accountability for security forces who had acted outside the law, reforms to prevent such incidents from happening again, better training for police and military in urban operations, oversight mechanisms to ensure proportionality in the use of force. Some of these recommendations were implemented. Others remain unfulfilled to this day. The cultural impact of the Dudus saga was profound. Documentaries were made, including 4 Days in May, Kingston 2010, which detailed the events of the incursion through interviews and archival footage. Art installations like Bearing Witness 4 Days in West Kingston attempted to process the trauma through creative expression. Musicians wrote songs, poets penned verses. The story became part of Jamaica's collective consciousness, a dark chapter that would never be forgotten. But perhaps the most troubling legacy is what happened to organized crime in Jamaica after Dudus's fall. You might think that removing such a powerful figure would reduce violence, would break the power of gangs. The reality was exactly the opposite. The Shower Posse, without its leader, fragmented. Rival factions within the organization fought for control. Other gangs, like the Klansman gang, saw an opportunity to expand into territories previously controlled by Dudus. Violence in Kingston actually increased in the years following his capture. Without the centralized authority that Dudus represented, as brutal and criminal as it was, there was chaos. Multiple smaller gangs competing for the same turf. More unpredictable violence. More innocent people caught in crossfire. It's a tragic irony. The removal of a criminal kingpin led to more, not less, bloodshed. This speaks to a deeper problem in Jamaica and in many countries facing similar issues. You can arrest the leader, you can dismantle the organization, but if you don't address the underlying conditions, the poverty, the lack of opportunity, the political corruption, the easy access to weapons, the violence will continue. New leaders will emerge. New gangs will form. The cycle perpetuates itself. In February 2025, news broke that Dudus's sentence had been reduced by 17 months under the First Step Act, a United States law that allows for sentence reductions for good behavior and participation in rehabilitation programs. His release date was moved from July 4, 2030 to January 25, 2029. At 56 years old, he would be released after serving about 17 years of his sentence. The announcement sent shockwaves through Jamaica. What would happen when Dudus returned? Would he attempt to reclaim his old territory? Would his return spark a new wave of violence? Would young gang members who had grown up hearing legends about him rally to his side? These weren't idle questions. Jamaican security forces began monitoring the situation closely, preparing for multiple scenarios. But let's pause here. and consider what Dudus's story really tells us. It's not a story about a Robin Hood figure who helped his community. It's not a story about a hero standing up to oppressive forces. It's the story of a violent criminal who manipulated an entire community, who used social programs as tools of control, who built his power on the backs of addicts and the bodies of his victims. Every school he funded was paid for with drug money, money that came from destroyed lives in New York, in Miami, in Toronto. Every meal he distributed bought him the silence of potential witnesses. Every medical clinic he built was a fortress in his empire. This wasn't generosity. This was strategic investment in maintaining power. And the people who defended him, who fought and died for him during the Tivoli incursion, they weren't making a free choice. They were products of a system that had offered them no alternatives. Born into poverty in a garrison community, surrounded by violence from childhood, with no legitimate economic opportunities, what choice did they really have? Dudus didn't save them. He trapped them. The political establishment that enabled him is equally culpable. Politicians who made deals with gang leaders, who accepted their money and their guaranteed votes, who looked the other way while communities were terrorized, who only acted when international pressure became unbearable. They created the conditions where someone like Dudus could thrive. They are part of this story's tragedy, and we cannot ignore the international dimension. The weapons that armed the Shower Posse didn't materialize out of thin air. They came from the United States, often through illegal trafficking networks that should have been shut down decades earlier. The drug money that funded Dudus's empire came from American consumers. The political connections that protected him during the Cold War era set the stage for everything that followed. This is what makes the Dudus story so important. It's not just about one criminal. It's about systemic failures at every level. It's about how crime, politics, poverty, and international dynamics intersect to create monsters. And until we address all of these factors, there will be more Duduses. Different names, different countries, but the same story. As of today, Christopher Dudus Koch remains in federal prison in New Jersey. He has less than 4 years left on his sentence. What he will do when he's released remains unknown. Whether he'll be deported back to Jamaica or allowed to stay in the United States under supervised release is still being determined. Whether he'll attempt to return to criminal activities or try to live quietly is anyone's guess. But one thing is certain, his legacy is already written. He will be remembered not as the benefactor he claimed to be, but as the criminal he truly was. A man who caused immeasurable suffering, who turned a neighborhood into a war zone, who corrupted political institutions, who left dozens dead in his wake, who showed that even in a small island nation, organized crime can challenge state authority and expose the rot at the heart of a system. The 73 people who died during the Tivoli incursion deserve to be remembered, not as statistics, not as collateral damage, but as individuals whose lives were cut short by violence that should never have reached such levels. Some were gang members, yes, but many were innocent civilians, young men who happened to be in the wrong place, women caught in crossfire, people whose only crime was living in Tivoli Gardens. Their families still mourn. The survivors still carry physical and psychological scars. The community is still recovering. And Jamaica as a nation is still grappling with what the events of May 2010 revealed about their society. This is the dark truth about Dudus, Christopher Michael Koch, not a hero, not a Robin Hood, but a criminal who built an empire on suffering and nearly brought a country to its knees defending it. His story is a warning about the dangers of allowing crime and politics to become intertwined, about the consequences of neglecting communities until they become fertile ground for gangs, about how easy it is for a single individual to accumulate dangerous levels of power when systems fail. As we close this chapter, remember, there's no glory in this story, only tragedy, only lessons that must be learned, only a reminder that we must remain vigilant against those who would use violence and manipulation to control others, regardless of how they try to disguise their true nature. The man who faced an army lost, but the battle for Jamaica's soul continues. And the question remains, will the lessons of Tivoli Gardens lead to real change, or will history repeat itself with a new generation of criminals and corrupt politicians? Only time will tell, but one thing is certain, we must never forget what happened. We must never allow it to be romanticized. We must see it for exactly what it was, a national tragedy that could have been prevented. Thank you for staying with me through this entire journey. If this story impacted you the way it impacted me, please share it. Hit that like button. Leave your thoughts in the comments. And remember, the truth, no matter how dark, must always be told.